There are a few common settings throughout video games that reappear again and again to allow the developer a stable base to launch their narrative from. The typical Middle Ages fantasy setting is by far the most popular world to set a role-playing game within. Horror games will often be set in familiar places with a sinister twist, and there's a tendency to look at the modern military when creating a first-person shooter. Developers do this to minimize the time that must be spent explaining the rules of the world to the player, allowing for them to start telling the story they wanted to tell, and use the player's collected experiences to fill in the gaps. Everyone knows that there's going to be big spiders in the caves, dire wolves in the forests, maybe even a sewer level under a town with no running water. And everyone knows that the reason this story is set in this world is so that the writer can focus more on developing interpersonal drama between their characters, or use the tropes of the setting to craft metaphors that align with something happening in the real world. But there are also many reasons for why a writer would set their RPG somewhere else. The narrative is introspective. No time to slay dragons and collect legendary amulets. That's too bombastic for this story about a single person. The world contains deliberate landmarks and cultural activity. The player isn't supposed to rush past the villages and decorations as they pursue their quest. Those villagers might be worth conversing with, and those decorations might have deeper meaning. If things change over time, the changes don't have to be drastic in order for a player to notice. Not every issue can be resolved by punching an evil wizard. Sometimes subtlety is necessary. Well, let's say that violence isn't always the answer. Disco Elysium is all of this, and more. There might be an investigation into a murder occurring here, but the narrative is very much focused on the main character. Martinaise is not too dissimilar to a lower income region of a modern sprawling metropolis, the town's primary industry being a distribution center for various cargo containers, and the residents crammed into tiny apartments within crumbling, war-torn buildings. This irregular setting seems to have informed the game's mechanics and presentation direction, forgoing a combat system entirely and implementing an impressionist artistic style. But is that really the case? Is it possible that the art style or gameplay design was made before the world was constructed? Is Revachol merely a consequence of a role-playing system designed without combat mechanics? The explorable area within Disco Elysium isn't overly expansive, but it is overflowing with intrigue and anguish. The player is initially gated to one half of the map before a bridge is repaired a couple of days into the investigation. On the eastern side is Martinaise proper, a collection of previously uninhabitable commercial buildings that the locals have rebuilt into a functioning community. The Whirling in Rags is a hostel with a bar and restaurant that frequently hosts meals for the nearby dock workers. Despite the level of disrepair throughout the town, there are plenty of people successfully making their way in the world in Martinaise, so circumstances aren't as grim as they appear. The dock workers are unionized, there are retirees, and people will willingly share food when asked because they aren't starving. There is hope amongst the rubble, and while the union is certainly striving for the best outcome for its members, it seems to have overreached. This has caused some unrest within the community, as union members are striking, and a group of anti-strike scabs have appeared in tense protest. This unrest doesn't seem to make its way across the river and into the western side of town. The western region is destitute, the people living in cobbled together shacks and having to subsist to see another day. The ruined buildings haven't been reinstated and stand rotting as a manifestation of the events that had occurred here. There's an abandoned church in the north, showing that while there is an air of optimism across the river, the western side has lost its hope. This division seems fairly reflective of the political relationship between capitalist and communist economic ideologies, as well as the encroaching miasma that sits somewhere in the middle. Eastern Martinaise hosts businesses and infrastructure, but they fail frequently. torn apart by the insatiable market and the war for profits. It is possible to scrape out a comfortable existence within the maelstrom, but you'd be one of the lucky ones if you succeeded. Western Martinez has experienced the great equalizer. The people can coexist, they don't starve, but they do wallow without lack of drive. Nothing really matters, so nothing ever changes. And then the Union exists, trying to extract the best for themselves from both sides, unwilling to accept anything less, because they hold the cards in this part of Revachol. A man awakens within this swirling gulf, stricken with amnesia, but still depressed. This is Lieutenant W. Freighter Harrier Desbois, although he currently isn't aware of that. Harry is a detective in the Revachol Citizens Militia and has a serious substance abuse problem. The detective awakens within a terrible hangover and must immediately deal with himself. Harry has segmented each of his cognitions into personified beings within his mind. As the detective examines the world around him, and frequently throughout conversations with others, these cognitions will chime in with their opinion, and can direct the course of conversation as a result. This enables a great deal of the situational gameplay mechanics, but it most certainly is not a healthy practice. Harry is also never really hindered by appealing to social etiquette. He'll ask strangers for money, he'll ask the most useless questions, he can almost always spout some strange nonsense. This is the lens the player must navigate this world through. But there are multiple iterations of Harry, depending on the player's chosen main stat category. My Harry was particularly empathetic, fully capable of telling someone exactly what they needed to hear in order to gain favor within the investigation. Another Harry might be especially studious, carefully considering the calculatable aspects of the case, and able to reconstruct most scenarios in a heartbeat. Since Harry has to be interchangeable in this way, he tends to be quite malleable in conversation, and the player is given a lot of flexibility in order to align Harry with their preferred characterization of him. He is still recovering from an intense bender, however. Harry is thus a reflection of the town around him, almost entirely obliterated, but on the mend. The identity Harry will gain throughout the game is as much a reflection of Martinez as it is the player-chosen characterization, which is a point toward the world informing the rest of the game, and also a commendation for the game's writing. I enjoy Harry's inner machinations, and when things get somber and his reptilian brain joins the conversation, I could almost always see an upward trend in the writing quality. That raw, instinctual side of Harry is painfully well defined, and I hope that the writer found this experience cathartic enough to relieve that pain themselves. The other characters in the game are similarly incredible.
The smallest church in San, though it once was larger.
Disco Elysium holds a wealth of surprisingly complex characters for the player to interview and learn from. Even the characters that seem little more than one note are developed to reveal some hidden depth. It's very easy to assume that Lawrence Gart, the unimpressed cafeteria manager, and Kuno, the amphetamine-addicted kid, are defined by those traits specifically. Gart's lack of interest in Harry's adventures are the definitive factor of the vast majority of possible interactions with the character. But with enough prodding, the player can learn of his curious mind, his cowardly streak, and his compassion and gratitude that can both be earned. There are some characters who aren't afforded this depth, but their appearance on screen is infrequent enough for this to be unnecessary. Racism is a frequent topic of conversation with many of the game's characters, and the more outwardly racist a character tends to be, the less development they get overall. Their purpose is to be surpassed, although Harry can engage with them if the player wishes to. Much of the racist conversation is inspired by the presence of Harry's partner for the investigation, Kim Kitsuragi. Kim endures a few unpleasant remarks, but is fully equipped to defend himself and retaliate if necessary. Kim's quite reserved overall, and is more than willing to allow Harry's zaniness to flourish in the pursuit of justice. I think Kim being a light in the darkness has contributed greatly to my affection for him, as well as how well he plays that straight man role. And Kim is written in a way that makes him seem aware of his brightness, because all of the characters within the game have been burdened with living in Revachol. Lead writer Robert Kurvitz, as well as the majority of the development team, are Estonian, meaning that they created this entire project in a second language, and yet the writing is magnificent. Truly, the use of descriptive language to paint intuited scenes is phenomenal, and I was especially excited whenever Shivers decided to make an appearance. Despite having the resources to show the player an image of the scenes being described by these cognitions, Zaum have selected to allow the writing to cultivate the image within the player's imagination. Revachol is a gargantuan city, and the player is only ever shown a small section of it. But with these descriptions, I feel as though I have a familiar understanding of what the skyline looks like, and the sensation of walking through the streets. And yet some things are left unexplained because they don't matter to the events currently occurring. The Pale is a dense fog that isolates the continents of the planet, although its origins and effects are rarely discussed throughout the game because it exists as a fact and doesn't garner much consideration from the people in the game. Religion and political ideation are not so set in stone, so the writing knows to spend more time with those aspects. The ideologies of the people on Elysium have led to great destruction throughout the world, and the resulting devastation has shaped the world itself. Disco Elysium features a variety of narrative ideas throughout the game's 25-hour runtime, but it is all wrapped in an oil-painted skin. From the game's textures to each of the character portraits, everything has observable brushstrokes across their surfaces. This gives the game a brighter, more vivid appearance, despite the bleak atmosphere. It also enables the impressionist portrait styles. Their abstractions indicating the degree of instability surrounding their representation. Since these images only appear when the character associated with them is involved within the conversation, I think of them as a visual representation of Harry's impressions of that person. If the portrait is simplistic and clear, then Harry's impression of that person is well defined and conclusively shallow. Sometimes the faces are almost hidden beneath slashes of colour, as if Harry can't get a read of their personality and has resorted to whatever surface impression he can glean. I think this is also why Kim is portrayed with a halo. Harry perceives Kim as an angelic entity who has appeared to guide Harry on his way back to sense, and is there to support Harry through the challenges of the case. The environment is superbly realized. Not only is Martinez technically flawless, but is structured in an entirely reasonable way that makes for a great video game environment as well as a representation of a real location. The character models are a little underwhelming, but I think they've been de-emphasized to keep the focus on the text block in the right, as well as to allow the portraits to do the faces better justice. There are poignant uses of these models though, particularly distressing scenes of Harry's depression manifest, or more character developing arrangements like Everard Clare's detestable comfortable pose are present throughout the game, showing that what was lacking in terms of texture detail is more than made up for in direction, and the voice acting is brilliant. There are some magnificent performances hidden throughout the game that are even more impressive when the variety of accents involved is taken into account. Revachol has no defined accent, so there are accents from all over combined together in a way that doesn't feel forced, and for them to be as consistently directed as they are is unbelievable. I'm unsure if all of the actors were sourced locally or not, but the entire cast seems to be on the same page, and rarely sounds like they're performing lines. But while I do love the narrator's voice, it does seem a shame to use it for all of the different cognitions too. Harry has 24 different segments of his mind that perk up whenever the situation arises. These range from his encyclopedic knowledge, which is a representation of Harry reaching into his knowledge base to produce an answer for the current situation. To his authoritativeness, Harry's ability to activate cop mode and demand the respect of those interacting with him, allowing himself to slip into an instinctual physical reaction to the situation, which the game calls half-light, and to things like his ability to interface with various objects like computers and mechanical locks. For a role-playing system, these stats clearly serve the same function as more traditional stat sheets, but their uses throughout the game are much closer to a tabletop implementation. There aren't items that require a skill investment to be able to use. Instead, while conversing with an NPC, the game will require a roll against a threshold in order to clear. If the player encounters a logic check, but their build hasn't invested many points into logic, then the required dice roll will have to yield a bigger number. I haven't been playing many RPGs lately, but there was something about this that was quite refreshing, and even a little nostalgic. I played a lot of 40k 7th edition, and rolling against thresholds was a big part of that game. Similarly, while the Heretic Kingdoms games do feature a skill leveling system, the skills aren't used for much besides meeting requirements in order to proceed through the game. If the player's health and damage isn't high enough, they won't be able to progress. Disco Elysium's actions and skill systems barely do this. Most checks in the game can be failed, and the game will continue. There are some mandatory checks in order to progress the narrative, but the majority either add additional context, additional characterization, or speed up the progression. It is possible to grind stats, and it is possible to save scum conversations in order to progress to the next stage slightly earlier than normal. But this is very much akin to asking a dungeon master if you can choose to pass the upcoming dice roll, instead of having to reap the consequences of an unsuccessful result. Failing in a tabletop role-playing game can still be enjoyable, especially within a conversation, as the players are able to properly engage and say the unconvincing thing aloud for the group to laugh along to. In a video game, a failure like this doesn't normally get the opportunity to still be enjoyable. Disco Elysium's failed checks are so frequently inconsequential that the tidbit of information the player misses out on won't require a reload to fix. The narrative will wait for the player to meet the requirements, and then continue trundling along. The game's narrative borrows heavily from the serialized detective stories written by the likes of Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie, and I can imagine many people being dissatisfied by that style of detective fiction. Often people assume detective fiction means that the story is going to follow that Scooby-Doo formula, where the mystery is introduced, and the villain is one of the people in close proximity to the scene, or the events that led to the crime can be traced backward, and things like motivation and methods can be deduced from circumstantial evidence. Video games are very suited to this style of detective fiction, but written stories are not, and consequently, the adventures of Sherlock Holmes are seldom deductible by the reader because Conan Doyle understood this. So, as a general spoiler-free statement, please be aware that Disco Elysium falls into that Holmes line of storytelling and not the Scooby-Doo line. I'll elaborate in the next section, but for those of you who haven't played yet, I do encourage you to experience the narrative yourself. There are a series of interesting self-contained mysteries to solve that interweave, like how the bookshop owner is eventually connected to the church in the north, but the actual detective work will be done by the characters and not the player. It's good, absolutely. Disco Elysium devotes a lot of time to the narrative, and some were correct to do so, but it's an unusual direction to follow considering the interactive medium the story is being told through. The Adventure of the Speckled Band is the 10th Holmes story, and was published in the Strand magazine within the February 1892 issue. Holmes and Watson are contacted by a young woman, Helen Stoner, who fears that her stepfather intends to kill her, after her mother passed and her twin sister died by a mysterious circumstance. The stepfather, Dr. Roylott, is seeking to claim the family estate and wealth for himself, and removing the other inheritors would achieve that end. He cannot kill his stepdaughter outright, because he would be revealed by the post-mortem, nor can he enter Helen's room now that Holmes and Watson are investigating. She has been forced to move into her sister's room by some renovations being done to hers, the same room that her sister had mysteriously died within. Holmes gets the idea to wait inside Helen's room in the night to confirm his suspicion that Helen still might be killed when nobody could enter the room via the door. What had been occurring was that Roylott was sending a highly venomous snake through the air vent into Helen's room each night, hoping that it would bite her. It would spend some time in the room before being called back through the vent by Roylott's whistle. While the reader is shown that the Doctor keeps a cheetah and a baboon as a pet, there is no way for anyone to deduce this. Roylott had apparently trained the snake to return to him by feeding it milk. Not only this, but in order for the snake to reach the air vent from within Helen's room, it would have to climb up a rope, which venomous snakes cannot do. People who play Disco Elysium cannot ever learn of Joseph Dross before they find him. Harry isn't a psychic. There's no way to use knowledge of ballistics since the broken window is repaired by the time the player gets to see it. And there isn't even a way to know that the island exists before preparing to travel to it. Harry and Kim do the detective work, not the player. Why the writer chose to do this, I can only guess. Estonia is a tiny country on the fringes of Scandinavia, populated by only 1.3 million people, but with the government's IT-facing policies, has managed to secure a fairly high standard of living. That hasn't always been the case, and the nation only cast off its Soviet status in 1991, meaning that many of Zaum's staff would have been living in that ex-Soviet world throughout the early years of their lives. Russia's most recent occupation had been long and destructive, and that world seems well reflected within Disco Elysium. While under occupation, Estonians were not permitted to leave the country, nor were they allowed to access any of the over 2,000 islands on the coast without Russian permission. The older generations of Estonians who had endured the authoritarian occupation seem to have made a strong impression upon Kurvitz, and his world seems to be an amalgamation of the ravaged old ways and the suspect new ones. This capitalism thing doesn't seem too great, but that communism thing was not good for Estonia, and the player will get to see Kurvitz's deliberation on these ideas upon further playthroughs. While it might not seem overly replayable, Disco Elysium offers the player a lot of branching paths and a wide range of choices within those paths, which can see Harry become an aggressive, by-the-books communist, or a drug-addled nervous wreck, and anything in between. Side quests can be failed or even ignored. The result of those activities will ripple through the rest of the narrative, and even draw the player to locations they may have spent little to no time within previously. The story beats may always be along the same lines, but to see each from a vastly different perspective, with even more of the game's fantastic writing, will absolutely warrant repeated returns. I chose not to work with Claire, for example. Even with the return of Harry's gun as an incentive, I could not bring myself to trust the guy. But without a weapon, one of the game's few action sequences will end in an undesirable way. I had figured that the shootout would be the game's conclusion. At this stage, I was expecting Scooby-Doo and not Speckled Band, so when Harry woke up, I was kind of dejected. What an ending it would have been! A punctual stop. This is the real world. The good guy doesn't always win. In some ways that would have been preferable. No new character to stumble upon, who immediately confesses. But as it is, Harry does win, and the wonderful ending seems hopeful against the misery of the setting. Harry doesn't just resolve a murder investigation, he becomes the catalyst to the realization of a dream, and he gets to go home with all of his friends. It's nice. If you haven't played Disco Elysium yet, I really think you should. I haven't spoiled much of consequence, and your experience will be filled with its own discoveries and challenges. Take your time, and don't be afraid to fail or say strange things. It's a role-playing game like no other. In the end, I think my question was doomed to yield unremarkable results. Revachol is far more than a consequence, as it was always going to be. A role-playing system that aims to capture the experience of the average police detective isn't going to be combat-orientated, and emphasizing the character's deductive abilities, as well as their mental distress, fits far more comfortably in that intended experience. While the artwork is incredible, it doesn't appear to have impacted the world much at all. Revachol is presented in impressionist oils because the world isn't exactly as it appears, and looking more closely will reveal the means to which it has been assembled. The narrative spends time exploring the world, the people within it, and the history that has made it. Buildings may be placed in one location for relevance to its surroundings or ease of access, but the world was already here. Next time, something a little less thinky.